Welcome back to Copper Star Precision, the channel dedicated to getting you more points in your competitive shooting endeavors. And today we're continuing our series about the NRL22 base class edition, how to go from base class to world class. And there's a lot of stipulations and caveats about base class, but we're gonna follow all the rules and we're gonna try and make the best rifle platform that we can. And today we're gonna be talking about optics. So as before, I've got a mystery box with a scope in it that we'll talk about at the end of the video. If you haven't seen the other video where I discuss what I believe is the best base class rifle for people just getting into the sport, I will send a link up into one of these corners wherever they have the cards for YouTube. So check that out and, agree with me, disagree with me, leave comments, tell me I'm an idiot, tell me you're excited for the new series, but whatever you want, just go check it out. And without further ado, let's do our same little decision matrix that we did with the previous video for scopes. All right, so in my humble opinion, what I believe to be the best NRL22 base class scope. Let's get into it and take a look at the contenders. So in one corner, we've got the Vortex Diamondback Tactical, 6-24 power, 50 millimeter objective lens, first focal plane. We also have the Athlon Argos BTR Gen 2, also 6-24 by 50. It's an illuminated reticle. It's also first focal plane. We're also going to take a look at the Bushnell Match Pro 6-24 by 50, first focal plane, as well as another Athlon scope, the BTR Gen 2 8-34, first focal plane scope. If you have noticed a trend with first focal plane, there's a reason for that. So let's look at those important factors. I did this with the rifle build. These are important factors to me. You may weight these categories differently, but this is what I kind of believe to be the criteria by which you should measure a scope, specifically for the NRL22, this style shooting competition. So as before, we have that price cap where the rifle and optic MSRP of both of those things, when you add them together, they got to be less than $1,200. We already spent $600 on the rifle. That basically leaves us scopes that are $600 and under for the optics. And I think it's interesting because there's like very cheap scopes that are not worth your time in probably like the $100 range. There's okay scopes, maybe in the $350 range. Then there's like the $500 scope range, and then it suddenly jumps to, $700, $800. So it automatically pushes us over budget. I mean, there are a lot of great scopes that are under $1,000, but if we spend $1,000 on a scope, we're gonna have $200 for a rifle, and I don't even think the base Ruger 1022 sells for that MSRP. So that's out of the question. So we're kind of in that budget range, $600 and less for scopes. First focal plane is a must-have. If you don't understand the difference between first focal plane and second focal plane, I probably should make a video describing the two, but essentially, in this game, we use holdovers and wind calls and all that kind of stuff. In a first focal plane, the reticle actually changes size as you zoom in the scope. And what that does is it means that the markings on the reticle are consistent at any magnification. That's really what you need to know. So if you're doing holdovers, you don't have to be at a certain magnification. That little tick mark for a 2 mil holdover is going to be 2 mils at 8 power as it is at 20 power, at 24 power. So for this game, I don't think anyone uses second focal plane scopes. That's really for, F-class shooters, bench rest shooters, which have only one target they're looking at a known distance. Then they don't need it, and they want those really fine crosshairs. First focal plane for this, for PRS, is an absolute must. Minimum parallax is a tough one because not a lot of scopes actually have you engaging targets less than 25 yards. A lot of parallaxes start at 25 yards, but there are times in this sport where we actually do shoot very close targets. They might be very small targets, but they're very close. And that parallax is essentially think of it as a focusing knob. You're not really focusing the scope. What you're doing is you're aligning the focal plane of the image that's projected by the scope to the focal plane of the reticle, so that if you move your head and you can't to one side or another, essentially those two images will stay in line. So even if you don't have a proper cheek weld and you're partially off one side to the other, the reticle and the relationship between the reticle and the target will not change if your parallax is set exactly to that distance. And because we're shooting targets that might be close up, having less than or even equal to 15 yards of parallax as a minimum will become very important. Magnification, this is a personal thing of mine. A lot of these competitions, when I'm going through a stage, I'm usually in the 12 to 18 power range. Sometimes if I'm engaging super small targets from a prone position where I'm very stable, I'll bump it up to the higher magnification ranges. I usually don't engage targets unless I have about 12x on the scope, maybe 10 on the low end. But you really got that sweet spot for the competition. You want enough magnification that you can see a decent field of view. You can see the targets, but you also want to be able to, transition. And when you're holding on a target, the more magnified you are, a little wobble at high magnification is going to look like a big wobble in your scope, and it can be disorienting. So you kind of want to find that balance. So I think that 12 to 18 range, and all the scopes in this presentation cover that, so there's no problem there. Internal adjustment. This is how much room you have to change the elevation and windage dials in the scope. It's pretty much always determined by scope tube size. So if you have a very thin tube, there's only so much that little crosshair can move within the thin tube in terms of the diameter of the tube. So if you have a small tube, you have very little range of movement. If you have a very thick tube, there's more room for that to basically move up and down, side to side. More is better, but you don't need a lot if you're not going to be shooting out to ridiculous distances with a 22 rimfire. And if you're doing the option 1 in any of the NRL22 matches, all of those targets are 100 yards and in. So it's really not a huge issue, but if you are going to push the limits of the sport and go to NRL22X matches, or if you have bonus stages that go out to 200-300 yards with a 22, having more internal adjustment is always going to be better. More important factors. Reticle design, kind of a personal preference, but having some sort of subtensions is important. You just don't want a simple crosshair or even a mill dot. If you don't know what I'm talking about, we'll definitely get into it when I reveal the scope, and we'll talk about all its features in a future video. So if you aren't subscribed, make sure you're subscribed, notifications enabled, so next time I put out a video, it's going to be about the rifle build, and that's going to be super exciting. So that being said, a lot of things call for windage holdovers or elevation holdovers. If you want to get farther in the sport, you have to learn how to use the tools at your disposal, and having a good reticle is generally it's part personal preference, but there are sort of preferred designs that give you more information while you're looking at the scope, which can always be beneficial if you know how to use it, and we'll talk about that. So a lot of scopes, they provide what they call a Christmas tree reticle, which would be a simple crosshairs, and then you'll have a cascading elevation and windage that goes out the further you go on the elevation scale. Probably one of the most popular. Turrets. Locking or non-locking, and mils or MOA per turret revolution. So locking or non-locking turrets just basically means you can lock in the elevation so that if you bump into something, it's not going to move. You don't have to worry about it. A personal preference. It's kind of a nice to have. It's not a necessary to have. What is important to me is sort of the mils or MOA per revolution. All of the scopes I'm going to be using are going to be in mils. It's just what I'm accustomed to. Not to say that you can't use an MOA scope, but I think a lot of people are transitioning in the sport to mil scopes. And when people, if you're asking, oh, what was your wind hold? They're going to be speaking the language of, oh yeah, I was holding 4/10, right of the plate or something like that. And they're talking about how far they were holding in mils. So if you have an MOA scope, you're going to do some quick mental math. I think a lot of people in the sport talk in mils, so it's probably beneficial to start on a mil scope if you don't already have one. But if you have a under $600 or under whatever dollar amount that goes with the rifle scope and MOA, don't toss it if it's going to work and it's going to fit some of these criteria. Run what you got. So not discouraging you from getting an MOA scope, but I think mils is the way to go. The number of turns per revolution is important because mil is base 10 essentially, because it's 1/10 of a mil clicks in increments. So having one revolution be 10 mils makes sense in my brain. Some of them, the scopes you'll see here, have 6 mils per revolution. So if you need to dial 8 mils, you're like, okay, one rotation is 6 plus 2, versus having 10 mils per rotation, you can just dial straight to 8. Or if it was like 12 mils, instead of 2 full revolutions, it's 10 plus 2. I think it's easier to work in base 10, my personal preference. Having a zero stop, also personal preference, not necessary, but definitely nice to have. It's a good habit when you get off a stage, either dial back to 0 or do something where you reset the scope and then remember to dial your dope for the next stage. It prevents you from messing up between stages. Having a zero stop is just an easy way to just grip the top of the turret and dial it back to 0, and you don't have to worry about re-zeroing the gun. So we have the decision matrix just like we had before. So we've got our different scopes here. Let's take a look at these criteria. Price, the Athlon and the Bushnell went out. The Bushnell Pro non-illuminated is $450. If you want the illuminated version, it is $500 or $499 or whatever it is. So they're all around that $500 mark, but that puts us well below sort of the $600 budget for a base class scope. So all of them meet the criteria. It's just if you want to go for the absolute lowest price to save as much money as possible, the Athlon 6-24 and the Bushnell are going to win out. Are they all first focal plane? Yes, that's a must-have. Minimum parallax, the first three have a minimum parallax of 10 yards. Athlon, the other Athlon goes to 15 yards. All acceptable. Having lower adjustment is definitely a positive. Magnification range, they all span that sort of my sweet spot, 12 to 18 range, so no problem there. Why would you want the higher magnification Athlon? When you're doing low development, like a centerfire rifle, when you're doing lot testing, and you're setting your zero and all that kind of stuff, having the extra magnification really lets you dial in exactly where your point of aim is, and can help you get good groups. It's also going to introduce probably some more lens aberrations, like chromatic aberrations. You might be more affected by mirage and all that kind of stuff when you're looking through the scope, but I think higher magnification helps. I think 24 here in this case is plenty for if you want to do precision work when you're trying to zero in your rifle. And I'm going to show you how to do all of that. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, stay tuned, watch more videos coming out soon in the next coming weeks, and we'll discuss it. But having a higher magnification when you're zeroing the rifle or lot testing to make small groups, in my opinion, helps. Internal adjustments, Vortex has 19 mils, the Athlon and Bushnell have 18 mils, and the higher magnification Athlon has 13 mils. I put it in red there. For me, that's a deal breaker. I'm using a 30 MOA base for the scope, which translates roughly to 9 mils of cant. And the rule of thumb is that you want the internal adjustment of your scope to be double that of whatever the cant on your rifle base is, or you want the maximum cant in your scope base needs to be half or less of your total elevation adjustment in your scope. And that reason is because if your scope is canted too high, there's not enough clicks to bring it sort of back up to get a zero at certain distances. I'm probably going to be zeroing these rifles at 50 yards. So if you don't have enough elevation to get back to zero, you're never going to have that zero stop. You're never going to have something that's set to zero. So you're never going to have like a way to dial to 50 yards. And a lot of targets are at 50 yards. So this kind of knocks the Athlon, the higher magnification Athlon, out of contention. But reticle designs, they're all, they all have options for target reticles. Turret travel per revolution, like I said, 3 of these scopes are 6 mils, but the Bushnell Pro, they got it right. It's 10 per revolution, working in base 10. You got 10 fingers. It's way easier to deal with. Turrets are locking. Bushnell has locking turrets, the rest don't. Personal preference thing, I think it's nice to have. Zero stop, the Athlon and Bushnell do. The Vortex does not. The Athlon higher magnification does not. And with that, it may be semi-obvious. I mean, there's one scope here that is completely green, and that is, of course, going to be the Bushnell Pro. So with that being said, I think it should be quite obvious what's in the mystery box. And look at that, it's a Bushnell Match Pro, so nothing really shocking there. Let me just say something about Bushnell. Obviously, I don't have any, I bought this with my own money. I don't take any money or sponsorships. I have Vortex scopes, I have Knife Force scopes, I've got scopes from every manufacturer of the major manufacturers. But this scope, first, Bushnell is a huge sponsor of the NRL22. That's why you see their name at the top of all the sort of match books that come out, the Courses of Fire. Their name is always over here somewhere in the top right corner. They're a huge supporter of the scope, and this scope was specifically built for base class. Like, it was actually designed to meet all the requirements for base class, and I think they knocked it out of the park. And I've got it here. This is what we're talking about. I purchased the optional sunshade and some of the scope caps, and I'll talk about this scope in depth in a review, but honestly, first impressions, fit and finish. Let me see if I can get you. Very tactile locking turrets, good magnification range, nice and smooth. All the controls are extremely smooth, firm, but smooth, not gritty or anything like that. Windage, same thing. Super tactile, really excited. So if you want to find out how we're going to use this and our Ruger Precision Rimfire rifle to make a pretty much blinged out base class to world class rifle, please stay tuned for the channel. Lots of new videos coming up. I'm going to show you how to mount scopes. I'm going to show you how to zero scopes. I'm going to show you how to lot test. I'm going to show you how to add a bunch of crap to your rifle to make it awesome looking and hopefully make you shoot it better with all the accessories. But we're going to add Arca rails. We're going to change grips. We're going to add bag riders. We're going to probably weight balance the rifle, all this cool stuff. So I've talked about what I think is the best rimfire rifle. I've talked about what I think is the best rimfire scope. Feel free to flame me in the comments if you disagree with me. Write angry 4,000 character diatribes. But my personal opinions, and we'll find out. I mean, if this rifle doesn't shoot, I'll be the first to tell you. So I have no personal connection to any of these brands. I just want something that works, that's reliable, that's accurate, and we're going to see if we can get there with this combination between Ruger and Bushnell. So if you're excited to see that, stick around, subscribe to the channel. Until I see you next time, score more points.